welcome everyone to this, which is actually the last conversation for spring 2024 in the Northern Hemisphere. And so I'm thrilled that you're all here, and I'm very excited to welcome both Peter Lippman and Laurie Laybourne in the conversation this evening. If I can just, I know many of you have been here for all of the conversations, but please use the chat liberally for reflections, questions, statements, disagreements, anything you feel or think or want to say. And if you want to, say where you're calling from, that would also be great. We will start with Peter and Laurie having an initial conversation, and then we will open it up. But please feel free, if you have burning questions and comments, put them in the chat. Peter will pick them up, or I will flag them as well. So without further ado, Peter, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself and Laurie, although everyone does have a little bit of the bio background. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Tamsin. Welcome, everyone. I've known Laurie now for about, golly, 7 or 8 years, and we've been engaging with really uplifting and exciting topics such as cascading risk and derailment risk, and that's what we're aiming to talk about more today. And really, I want to put the focus onto Laurie and his work right from the start. So, Laurie, could you maybe start by telling us a bit about yourself and how you got interested in this area of work?
I can do. And hi, everyone. It's lovely to be with you. And thanks hugely for the opportunity to be talking with you today. And I'm looking forward to how our conversation goes over the course of the time that we have together. I largely work for think tanks and research organizations in the UK. And I'm, in broad terms, working on a question that seems to be in a growing number of people's minds, including in this network, which is what happens next as we head further into dangerous climate change and a worsening climate and overall climate and ecological crisis. And I'm going to share one quick slide to help frame how I got into this a few years ago. So hopefully everyone can see this. It's the only slide I have, I promise. And I know I'm not really allowed them, but I managed to get away with this one. So a few years back, probably in January or February, I was looking at the latest figures that you get every year about how steep the emissions reductions we're going to have to do are going to be. And this is the latest version of that. And for many years, I had been working on the policies that we need to get down these lines to reduce emissions at the scale that's required in the vanishingly short amount of time that's required. And it's very clear from a cursory look at these lines and how steep they are that those policies have got to be transformational. They've got to go beyond what the mainstream is currently contemplating. While I was looking at this, and it was, telling us all the same news that those reductions curves are getting steeper and steeper, I, on a whim, and I can't remember why I did this, I went on the UK government website, and there is a page on the UK government website where you can put in your birthday and you can check to see when you're going to retire, or more accurately, when you're going to receive your state pension, or when you're projected to reach your receive your state pension. So if I was doing that about here, it told me that I was going to retire about here, which made me think, well, hang on a minute. Over the course of my career span, let alone my lifespan, my career span, I'm now 35, we're going to have to deliver on a number of these environmental goals. These just show you a few plausible pathways. There are obviously many in between. And in looking at it like that, it made me think differently. And the main way it made me think differently was how we use so many graphs like this, and they show really smooth lines, smooth curves, whether they're steep or they're shallow, for how we will reduce emissions over time. And we debate hugely about how our policy ideas, our plans for the world for dealing with climate change will or will not send us down these curves. But we don't talk enough about what climate change will do in return to those plans. And I was looking at this in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was clear that those smooth lines are going to experience some pretty bumpy things along the way. Pandemics, huge impacts on our ability to grow our economies, and so on and so forth. And so we're in for a bumpy ride. And that ultimately made me think a bit differently about the overall stories that we use, the frames that we use to talk about the climate and ecological crisis. And I think that sometimes we could characterize that frame as something like a cliff edge frame, a car heading towards a cliff, and we've just got enough time to change direction or to slam on the brakes, or a mixture of both. Or my favorite one is a storm analogy. We're on a ship, there's a storm on the horizon representing climate change, and the job is to change the bearing of that ship, and ultimately we will avoid sailing into it, we will sail around, and all will be well. We will avoid catastrophic climate change. But the problem is that we are in that storm now. And that's very clear from the events that we've been seeing in recent years. And it's also clear that we're going to head further into that storm. I think a key indicator of that is that the likelihood of us going over 1.5 degrees of global heating is now increasingly likely. And when you're in a storm, the first priority remains. It's the same as trying to navigate around it. You've got to get away from it. But a second challenge arises, which is that your ability to navigate will be frustrated by the effects of the storm on that ship. You're going to be distracted by large waves coming out. There's a hole in the hull. Someone's jumping overboard with a lifeboat and so on. So our ability to get down these curves could increasingly be frustrated. The escalating impacts of the climate and ecological crisis are brought to bear. So in a nutshell, the work I'm doing at the moment is trying to better understand what the conditions are going to be like as we head deeper into that storm, and what strategies we will need to be able to better navigate out of it without the conditions of that storm overcoming us. So that in a nutshell is what my work focuses on, using that analogy.
And you've been particularly focusing on varying kinds of risk as part of your way of assessing this. Could you just tell us a bit more about the things like cascading risk or derailment risk in this context?
So I'll tell you a bit more about derailment risk, because this gets to the heart of the work that we're doing, and why I use that analogy of a storm. The world did not avoid, I would say, globally dangerous climate change. So we're likely to be going over 1.5. That puts us in the zone of risk for some of the major climate tipping points, these abrupt moments where parts of the environment can no longer cope with climate stress. So what are the consequences of being in that globally dangerous climate change? It will mean more pain and cost and so on. But there's something that exists on a higher level than just the worsening impacts. It's that they will frustrate our strategies. That dynamic that I just described. When you're in a storm, you need to navigate out, but your ability to navigate could be frustrated. In technical terms, we're proposing to call that derailment risk. So this is the idea that those worsening consequences could derail us from a path in which we were able to avoid the very worst climate outcomes. And we're doing work at the moment to try and better map different types of derailment risk. So let me give you some examples. One which often comes into people's minds, and we've done a bunch of interviews to sort of gauge people's perceptions of this potential, is political polarization. That as climate damages get worse, it will lead to impacts that will then be exploited by often the far right, but it could be political extremists in general, who will then water down action to reduce emissions and probably to ensure that societies are better adapted. So then climate change gets worse, then there's more chaos, more opportunity for extremist politics, less cooperation and action on dealing with the climate crisis, and you're stuck in this vicious cycle or doom loop. There are other ones as well. There's one we call resource attrition. So where a country, a polity, an organization even are being hammered so hard by climate impacts that the resources required to deal with those disasters then distract from or draw away from resources that would be used to reduce emissions and to become more resilient, which then means climate change gets worse and the impacts gets worse, which uses up more resources and so on. So derailment risk is for us the technical concept for what it's going to be like to be heading further into the storm of globally dangerous climate change. And in the extreme, derailment risk on aggregate globally, we could get to the point where we are so distracted, so having to deal with the consequences of the climate crisis, and it's distracting us from dealing with then tackling the causes of the climate crisis. It gets so severe that the aggregate level of emissions reductions is suppressed below whatever a critical threshold is to avoid some of the most catastrophic outcomes. And maybe we could go into that in a little bit for me to give a sort of idea of what I think that is. And we've been developing this as a concept. We're also doing some work to try and identify some weak signals of where we might already be seeing derailment risks. Example of that could be the farmer protests, the agricultural protests in Europe. They were caused by a very complex set of issues, by high levels of inflation, partly a result of worsening climate extremes, plus the profiteering of supermarkets, plus some changes in policy from the European level. That was then reported by the media as a too simplistic a story of environmental policy leads to farmers getting really angry, which then was exploited by the far right, who are then trying to push back on concepts like net zero. So that's, I think, what I would describe as a weak signal of the sort of emergence of these types of dynamics. Derailment risk isn't the Trump first term, but it might be because that was largely driven by other factors, the failure of neoliberal economics and other things. But in the future, a situation where a Trump or Trump type person is elected as a result of how people deal with climate damages and deal with the impacts of the climate transition is where we really start to get into the territory of derailment risk. So we're in a storm. Our ability to the risks to our ability to navigate are what we refer to as derailment risk.
Which all makes a lot of sense, but I was struck by the fact that you said that you're defining it. So are you saying that the people who, for their careers, their work is to think about risk, to assess risk? Are you saying that this concept just doesn't exist before your work?
I mean, I think it, from what we've seen, it exists intuitively for people. If you take the mainstream literature on many climate risks, particularly in the policy world, the world that I know best, they categorize those risks largely into two areas, into physical risk and into transition risk. Physical risk being the risks that result from the impacts of climate change, the impacts of storms and so on. And then transition risk are the risks that result from climate action itself, like the potential for certain classes of investment to no longer be profitable and that to cause financial distress, for example. But we're finding it difficult, and I would love it if people here have come across this, to engage in a policy conversation where people are saying, well, hang on a minute, the consequences of physical risk and transition risk could create this derailment dynamic that could end up distracting us away from action to deal with the environmental crisis itself. So when we talk to people and interview them, particularly in a policy context, they intuitively get the frame. They've been thinking about it maybe, but we've yet to see it as a mainstream area of risk assessment and of risk management. And I think that's got a lot to do with the failings of mainstream approaches to risk assessment of the environmental crisis.
So the people who are paid to think about risk, the actuaries working for the reinsurance companies or the military planners, they're not expressing it this way. Are they grappling with this issue, this kind of issue?
I think one of the issues here is around scale. The question is which actor, which organization is operating at the level of effectively of grand strategy that is interested in the overall transition. If you're an individual firm or company, you obviously care about the transition as an individual working in that firm, and the cultural ethos within your organization, within your bank, say, or your insurer or your military organization might be that you care about it. But at the end of the day, you will care about bits of it that mean the most to your agenda. So if you're a bank, you care about how climate damages could degrade your profits and assets, and you care about how the transition, climate action could also do the same. Do you care about the overall transition? It's harder to see that those actors it sort of operate on that scale. And so what we found from the research that we've done is that it really is only at the government level, and I personally think at the national security level, that full feedback loop that exists in climate risk of climate change causes risk to society. Those risks will have consequences which could distract us from dealing with climate change, which will have, and so on. That it's only really at that highest level of government. And that's one of the reasons why this is yet to be, from what I've seen, a mainstream agenda, is partly because of the failings of the way that governments do then risk assess the climate challenge, because they don't even necessarily see that things will become so severe that it then could create this derailment risk dynamic.
So maybe that's a segue into the mainstream approach to risk assessment and the weaknesses that you've perceived in that.
Yeah, so if you look at the risk assessments done by major institutions, governments, pension funds, and so on, they are anticipating that our future in this storm, and as we head further into the storm, will be relatively benign, relatively calm. So if you look, for example, at the UK government's last official climate change risk assessment, UK government is a rare example of a government that does that. It says that by 2045, under probably at that point around 2 degrees of global warming, the impact on the UK will be about 1% of GDP. That's about a tenth cheaper than the impacts of COVID on the UK. So it's an order of magnitude cheaper. Similarly, if you look at pension funds, there's some great work by the economist Steve Keen on this. Let's just take the example of an Australian pension fund, which is common for many pension funds. They use analysis to look at their climate risks over time. And they think that by 2100, under a scenario of 4 degrees of global heating, that the impacts on their assets will be completely manageable. So these assessments are missing something, and they're broadly missing 3 things. They are not assessing interconnected risks. I'll explain these more in a minute. They are looking more at the average situation and not the extreme. And they're dealing with uncertainty really poorly. They're basically making the assumption that what we don't know might not be that bad, when actually the right way to approach it is that what we don't know might be extremely bad. And altogether, that means that much risk assessment, like those examples I've just given, are aligned to the best estimate, the sort of most what feels like the most reliable, instead of the extreme. And any risk assessment focuses on the extreme. And I'll just give you a very quick example of a historical analogy here where a similar issue happened and then it changed. And that's when it came to risk assessment of the consequences of nuclear war. So at the beginning of the 1980s, some of you may have been involved in some of these discussions or remember this. The federal government in the US was basically, or officials in the federal government were basically saying that nuclear war wasn't that bad. It was really severe, potentially devastating, but it was manageable. Official government documents and spokespeople were saying that in a full-out nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, 80% of the population of the US would survive. 95% of the landmass would be untouched. And so, to quote a FEMA film shown to Congress people in the US, it won't be the end of the world nor the end of the nation. And what was happening was similar to what we're seeing with climate change risk assessment now. It didn't include the assessments that they were relying on didn't include interconnected risks. They were looking at the immediate impact of the bombs and not the knock-on consequences. They were looking at average situations, a muted nuclear exchange, for example, instead of the full-out thing, which would likely happen if the nuclear weapons started to fly. And then when it came to uncertainty, because we haven't had a nuclear war, thankfully, it was an assumption that the uncertain things, the things we didn't know, would be relatively benign. And then the concept of nuclear winter came along. which didn't happen until 83, 84. And Carl Sagan, the US scientist, was a part of some of the studies and used his platform, right, to get that out there. And what nuclear winter was doing, alongside other things at the time, was basically saying, no, let's look at those interconnected risks. That the bombs would fall, the fires and ejecta would then cause a layer in the atmosphere, which would then impact crops, make world cooler, impact crops, and there would be famine. And there were other analyses that looked at those interconnections. Nuclear winter also basically showed us that the things we don't know and may only just have thought of could make the risk even worse. And what it meant was that by the middle of the 80s, partly through some amazing cultural outputs that then cottoned onto this, we were aligning our idea of nuclear war with the extreme thing. It'd be very difficult to imagine a situation now, though it's always done, that you could, that officials could sanction the idea that 80% of the population would survive in the US and so on. So we need a similar thing now with climate change. As similar weaknesses in risk assessment need to be dealt with along those areas, partly so that we have this idea of the extreme in our minds, which I think is a certain set of climate tipping points, the ones in the ocean circulations. But this is where the analogy with nuclear war breaks down, and I'll finish with this. We don't just need that so we have a very clear shared understanding of the thing we must absolutely avoid. We also need better risk assessment to better understand the things that unfortunately are probably now unavoidable along the way to the worst thing that could happen, because they are our best. They are, to go back to my storm analogy, the way we develop risk assessment is the way we develop situational awareness. The things that are inevitably going to happen, the waves that are coming our way in the storm that unfortunately are unavoidable. And we need to have a better resolution on those, or else they will surprise us more. We won't be fully prepared, and we will continue to head on a trajectory towards the thing that we must avoid.
So just following on that, then you mentioned ocean currents. Presumably you're talking about AMOC amongst other things, but I know, and I saw a question flash past at one point about the subpolar gyre and some modelling you've been involved with. Could you tell us a bit more about those?
Yeah, so I've had the honor and privilege to be involved with the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. I'm a visiting fellow there. And for those of you who've not come across GSI, it's a world-leading site of expertise on climate tipping points. And we led a huge, the most comprehensive study of tipping points, the state of the art, which was released in December last year, called the Global Tipping Points Report. Just Google it and you'll be able to see it. And through that report and through other work we've done, it's become very clear to me that we have got to start to point to some of these tipping points as those extremes that are possible. There are a bunch of other extremes, of course, multiple synchronous breadbasket failures, and many things that should be associated with the extreme that we must avoid. But I think it is the collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. For those of you who've not come across this, this is the conveyor belt, as it were, that exists up and down the Atlantic that moves warmer water up towards the polar regions, where it is then the heat is then released and then heads back down as exchange. And it's one of the major things underpinning the climate system. The scant assessments that have been done of the impacts of what on the things that we care about or that we understand. By that, I mean, not just the impacts climatically, but on things like food, which really gets to risk assessment. They show that it could be, I think, globally catastrophic. It could wipe out, along with the effects of underlying climate change, it could wipe out over half the growing area for wheat globally, and for maize, corn globally as well. So that's when you then layer in, per the nuclear winter example, the interconnected risks and the uncertainties of the other things that can happen at the same time, it's quite difficult to see how you would be able to come back from, how global civilization would be able to come back from that. So that is for me, that is an example of the kind of thing that does need to be in people's minds now. In the same way that, if you went out in the street and you asked people, how bad could nuclear war be? And you really got them to explain, they would probably have some version of it that included things like nuclear winter. If you asked them about climate change and you really pushed them and said, how bad could it be? I think they'd have a general intuition it could be very bad. But to be able to put their finger on saying, no, climate change means that over half the two staple crops underpinning the global food system the growing area could be wiped out. It's not yet happened. So we're not yet aligning with that extreme. But then, per my point about the things that we may not avoid, there is another tipping point in the Atlantic circulations, a smaller one that we might describe as an intermediate tipping point. And that is the convection currents in the what's called the North Atlantic subpolar gyre. And this is one of 5 tipping points that was identified in the Global Tipping Points report that is at imminent risk of being triggered at current temperature levels. And the problem is that this is even less explored and assessed than AMOC. So yes, I've been leading some work where we've just tried to get a scratch idea of what some of the impacts of the collapse of this tipping point could be. And in short, this is hugely uncertain, very complex, but it is not as bad as AMOC. It could happen and not trigger AMOC, but it is analogous to the types of effects. It leads to, for example, cooler conditions across North America and Western Europe that could be destabilizing for the food system. I think this is very interesting because a lot of the modeling is suggesting that the risks of it being triggered, the probabilities, the likelihoods of being triggered now are high. They should be a cause of serious concern for us, and that it could collapse even in scenarios in which we actually do get to net zero by 2050. So in some ways, we might think of this SPG collapse as an indicator of the level of risk that has been piled up on top of us already by climate change. And the last thing I'll say on this is I'm particularly interested in it because let's say the SPG collapses and it causes all sorts of disruption. From what I have heard, and this is an area where I think science needs to really focus on, an SPG collapse could also further weaken the AMOC. It's a big question that needs to be answered. But let's say it does. Let's say it weakens it by something like the amount it's already been weakened. It's been weakened by about 15% since 2050. Let's say the SPG collapse leads AMOC to be weakened again by another 15%, say. Don't know, but let's just for argument's sake say that. We're then in a critical action moment globally because the AMOC is even weaker, and therefore we need to engage in global emergency action to reduce emissions to ensure that the risk of AMOC ultimately then collapsing is seriously reduced. But at exactly that critical action moment, many countries around the world could be distracted by dealing with the adverse consequences of an SPG collapse. And I think this is the kind of assessment that now needs to happen to identify these global derailment risk scenarios. And my concern is that potential domino effect of SPG and AMOC, and I'm not saying domino necessary in the climate system sense, but that SPG collapses, distracts us, AMOC is weakening, that's an extremely dangerous and under-assessed area. And I think it's one that helps us understand the interplay between extreme climate risks like tipping points and this derailment risk concept we've got.
It keeps coming back to me as you talk, apart from just how very real you make it feel, is we've known on a rational basis, we being a kind of strange universal word for human beings, or a lot of people have known that this is going on, but there hasn't been a particularly effective or proportionate response to it. To what degree is your analysis hoping that rational action, rational response will kick in as a result of a very scientific and rational analysis?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is a very good question to ask. The first thing to say is that I'm not talking here about an information deficit theory of change, right? That, at last, everyone knows about AMOC collapse and that's going to change things. I think there is, though, a element of that for a very specific audience segment. So when we talk about, better risk assessment and that putting the finger on extremes, again, per your point about this non-existent we of humanity, we really should be focused on a very particular group of people, which are the professional risk assessors within certain institutions. And they are not, per my example of the UK government's climate change risk assessment, per the work that's been done on things like pension funds, they are not undertaking effective risk assessment. And that does have to change. And they are not doing that necessarily because they are aware of things like AMOC. I've met innumerable risk assessors in those and other institutions, and they are not necessarily thinking about these things. They haven't necessarily assessed them. They've not got the models that enable them to do it in the way they would like to do it. They are finding it very difficult to break from the culture of always having to assess things with numbers on, instead of having a risk assessment culture that's more qualitative, that's about stories of things that could happen in an uncertain future. So part of this is about improving risk assessment in institutions that we rely on to accurately risk assess. So there is a bit of that. But there's another part of this, which is that this is not about layering on more information of things that might happen in the future as a stimulant to act and avoid them definitively now. This is a responsibility of people who are in climate movements, who are more strategic and so on, to basically start to consider applying this lens and saying, okay, hang on a minute, let's take a campaigner who's focused on degrowth. How do you win a argument about degrowth and degrowth policies in a 1.5 plus degree world with the strategic context that your campaigning will face then? If you're a philanthropic funder and your strategy is built around funding negative emissions technologies and carbon capture and so on, how does that strategy play in a world in which bits of the biosphere are falling apart because of feedback loops and so on? And we've got to get beyond the idea that we are going to definitively avoid these things. They are now going to be a part of the strategic context in which our activities are played out, not 100 years hence, in the coming years. So this is about an understanding of the different strategic context in which our work is having to head through.
Thank you. I'm very aware that there's some great questions starting to pop up, and we're going to come to a kind of Q&A in about 5 minutes. But I just wanted to throw in a couple of other points that really link to this. How do societies respond? Because it strikes me that what we've seen since the 80s is a massive privatization of societal responses and responsibilities. And you're saying that maybe governments should be taking this more seriously, leading on it. How does that fit with what we've seen about governments, particularly on the Anglo-American model of kind of privatizing everything?
Yeah, it's another reason that we need to move beyond neoliberalism and the prevailing attitude towards how government policy is done, and particularly response to the climate crisis in the context, as you give there, of Western governments. An example of this that is slightly unformed is, for me, how understanding that we're now in dangerous climate change, globally dangerous climate change, and heading deeper into it, how that affects the strategy of climate disclosure. So let me explain what I mean by this. So per your point, Peter, about the kind of privatization of the transition, governments are relying hugely on private investors to take up a lot of the challenge of moving investment around. And that's partly a result of how the global financial system works. What are the mechanisms then by which you drive them to do it? Well, one of the key ones is disclosures. You get them to disclose their assessments of the risks they face, which will then lead to increasing pressure for them to make sure that they're getting out of fossil fuel investments and that they're making sure they're more resilient to what comes down the line. I worry about something that we might call the delayed disclosure trap, which is that let's say right now you had a bank or any financial institution that was just like, hell, we're going to do an assessment of what happens when AMOC collapses on our assets, right? Which is now unfortunately a plausible scenario. And you publish that, it would be material. It would materially affect your institution, right? If you said, hey guys, AMOC collapses, wipes out our investments. If you're the only one who's done that, it will have a could have an immaterial impact on what you're doing. So the more we delay in disclosing this risk in certain domains, the greater the incentive is to not disclose it. And at the highest level, that is my concern about, even if you did get into a situation where you did get better risk assessment and understanding of the fact that we're now in this worsening storm, that the very act of disclosure is going to be a destabilizing moment in itself, financially, as I've described, but also psychologically, also politically. And you could say that one of the features of the climate movement in recent years has been people are essentially getting the disclosure on an individual level, and that's having a pretty severe psychological impact on them.
So aren't you really saying that not just under neoliberalism, but under a basically dominant capitalist system, we can't respond proportionately to the existing risk, let alone the risk that's coming down towards us?
Yeah, and there's a really interesting report by a university in the UK, or a bit of University College London in the UK, which looked at ecological tipping points and the consequences for financial institutions. And they're basically like, okay, if the Amazon collapses, an example of a ecological tipping point, the impacts on financial systems could be so severe, they could actually be a systemic risk to financial institutions, which then means that there is a reason, therefore, for central banks to intervene and do something about this, but to force financial institutions to not invest in things that could lead to ecological tipping points. But actually, the policy toolkit of central banks is not enough to do that. So central banks need to work with government agencies like financial ministries and industrial strategy ministries to take an all systems approach to this, and it won't just be one government. So it's a really interesting paper, because it comes up to your point there, that the further we head into this storm, the bigger the questions are then raised about the appropriateness of what is the so-called strategy so far. I mean, there is no overall strategy, right? There's no world government, but the market strategy.
I kind of one last linked point, and then I think we should start to look at the questions. But if you think about historical responses to potential cataclysm, meaningful ones have to involve societies really working together rather than being polarized. And one of the ways in which you enable that is by sharing both risk and reward equally, whether it's a system of rationing, whether you massively reduce inequality, whether you make sure everyone has access to land, whatever, depending on the societal constructs. What do you think the link is, or might be, between taking this concept of derailment risk and tying it to much more overtly ideological, or maybe it's only overt, but the ideological concepts of, for example, how much we need to deal with inequality as part of our response to what's going on in the world at the moment?
So I think that in the final analysis is how we will be able to handle these derailment risks. I think it boils down to our perceptions of fairness and how we then manage those worsening impacts. So we interviewed loads of people to run with this storm analogy who have piloted certain vehicles through storms, and asked them, hey guys, what are the key features that you need to be able to continue to maintain the integrity of your navigation to get out of the storm, while also managing the impacts of the storm on ship, plane, whatever? And you can imagine logically what the answers were. You need to have good situational awareness, things like risk assessment. You need to have faster speed. So we've got to, at a societal level, get rid of these ideas of austerity and so on, because our ability to finance things is a key part of our ability to have speed. But everything kept coming down to our ability to maintain that cooperation. And I think that in the final analysis, that's about fairness. And I think, let's go back to that example of those tipping point collapses, SPG collapse, for example. How that will have a material impact, but it will also have a psychological impact. And those two things combined are going to be absolutely critical, because people's perceptions of, people will be feeling the impact, but they will also be contextualizing why this happened, who was responsible. And one of the things that really concerns me about some of the really extreme things that are now, unfortunately, increasingly likely, is that they play out on time horizons that are difficult for the political process, and they express themselves in counterintuitive ways. So SPG collapse, while could play out quite quickly for a tipping point, we're talking the scale of 5 to 10 years. So we're talking the time scale of parliaments. That's an extremely long period of time for the information cycle. So the kind of COVID effect of like, it comes, builds, and then comes quickly, you know, exponential change, isn't necessarily a feature there. It is on climactic timescales, but it's not when it comes to political timescales. So that's confusing. And then the impacts of it are doubly confusing because they could lead to colder conditions, damagingly cold conditions, which are again counterintuitive because climate change is about things getting hotter and stuff, right? So what we get there is that you will have a material impact, a confusing context for that happening, then within the frame of how our group psychological responses occur to this. And it will for me, it will only be if, as those things happen, people are bought into decarbonisation. It feels like their transition, maybe at a very local level. And it feels like a fair transition, again, at a very local level, that we will have a chance of dealing with that derailment risk. You know, if the UK food supply is impacted by the triggering of a climate tipping point, and everything's extremely chaotic, and everything is very top down and unfair, and it still feels like it's those politicians foisting net zero on us, and look, our food supply is screwed up, then you've got derailment risk. You're maximizing your derailment risk. If instead decarbonisation is rooted locally, and you conceive of it in terms of things becoming fairer, then there's a chance of maintaining that decarbonisation even under duress. But there's still a role, of course, for leadership, including at national levels, because those leaders have a certain platform and they have to contextualise what's happening, who is to blame, why this occurred, and deal with the psychological responses to being under conditions of duress. And their ability to be seen as caring about fairness, which is something that they have to have built a reputation for before, is, I think, critical to dealing with derailment risk.
Great. Thank you, Laurie. I think we're pretty much bang on halfway through, so it's time to open it up to questions. And I see that Chris Langdon has had a number of questions. Maybe, Chris, are you able to kind of bring them all into one thing for Laurie to deal with? And then maybe after that, I could turn to Justin Kenrick.
I'll do my best. Can you hear me okay?
All good?
Good. I'm a huge fan of what Laurie is doing with colleagues at the GSI in Exeter. So everything I'm saying is supportive, but not in any way to be critical. Laurie, one of the things that I really would encourage fellow people working at Exeter, and I helped set up the conference in 2022 that led to the report you described, is to paint a word picture of what it might look like if the subpolar gear might trip. I'm talking not just about issues to do with temperatures, but that's important, issues to do with sea level rise, impact on fisheries in places as varied as West Africa or Scotland, Scottish fisheries. Just one of the things I think we need to do is to communicate this clearly, what it might look like on our best scientific evidence. And I completely understand, and that's what I really salute you for, how you link that work with work on the sort of political, economic, social issues. But it would be really helpful, I think, just to hear from you, given all the work you've done with Jesse Abrams and Tim Lenton and others, just what might it look like were in 5-10 years the subpolar gear tips?
Thanks, Chris. And it's a very good challenge, and it goes to the heart of the point that I was making around, as you know, around climate change risk assessment, that it is not, one of the problems of it is it doesn't exist in the risk currency that certain decision makers trade in, that they hear things about climatic extremes, but unless that's expressed in terms of things like the impact, as you're saying, on food or on geopolitical advantage for nations, you know, these are the things that really matter for decision makers. Specifically on the subpolar gyre, we are publishing a paper later this year. There will be some information on what that means for things like food supply and how it would impact things like the growing season length of food and what that might mean. The issue here, though, is that this should have been assessed and needs to be assessed fully by governments. Far more investment needs to be made in assessing these things so that we can understand the risks down to the specificity and relevance that you're describing there. So we've done our best job with basically no resources, and we're using the SPG as a case study to highlight those failures with risk assessment where it really matters, particularly when it comes to national security. We hope to.
All you're doing, Laurie, is.
Sorry.
I think what you're doing is great.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Your elbow.
Thank you. Thanks. And ultimately, just to let you guys know, we're evolving, and what are a number of projects. By we here, I mean a set of people who've been working on a variety of projects across different institutions. We're going to evolve that work into an initiative we're calling the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative, SCRI, and that will launch at some point over the next 12 months. And that will be in the staid language of a think tanker, forgive me, but a think and do tank that's about thinking, about assessing what it's going to be like to be further in the storm and the threats therein for sustainability transformations. But then on the do side, apply that research through capabilities development, through other things that can help people in government, but also in the climate movement, in philanthropy and so on, to begin to play around with the capabilities that they will need to steward, to navigate their strategies through that less stable world. And a bit of that work includes an emerging leaders program that we call Cohort 2040, because obviously some pretty severe intergenerational consequences of this.
Great, thanks. Turning to Justin, you had a couple of separate questions, I think, if you can combine.
Yes, no, really, really helpful, Laurie. Fantastic work. And just to facing the reality of what's going on, incredibly helpful. I'm just wondering if there's a different reality we maybe need to face too, which is that this political system, so-called civilization, is driving all of this, and we can't turn to it to try and find solutions. It's just a suggestion that looking at policymakers and governments and election cycles as being kind of somehow in there, we can find solutions. So when you referred to the nuclear winter stuff from the 1980s, I thought it was really interesting. And the other part of that, I mean, I was part of that whole anti-nuclear stuff that was going on then, and the role of NVDA and the role of kind of the public taking action when those in power were kind of saying there's no need for this. And we're in a similar situation, obviously, we have been until recently, in terms of climate action. It's been very high up the agenda. But I guess I'm just wondering whether there's a need for the same kind of what you're doing now around the climate itself, to be around the system driving it, so that we lose some sense of hope. With the hope count earlier, I loved it when Peter's word hope echoed in this session. That was very nice. But I'm just wondering if there's some need to really give up on having hope in the system as providing a solution, and instead be looking to how we solve this. And I just give you a very simple example. Today I was going down the lane here. I live right next to the sea in Portobello in Edinburgh, and a woman turned to me who I know and said to me, "Hey, your article's going to be front page of the local newspaper." The article is on storm surges, climate change, and the impact on Portobello, where I live. And the impact of that article will be very small, but will have a really drastic impact on the price of my flat. So there's a need to take the action that we take that actually does destabilize our support for the system that we're all relying on, does have immediate impacts on us. And just the need to take the other step of courage, which is to say, we can't rely on this particular system. We need to develop ways of making decisions, ways of supporting each other, ways of growing food, and ways of making political decisions that don't rely on these elections, but rely on a bottom-up system. Do you think there's a need for that process too, to go parallel with what you're describing?
Yes, 100%. And yeah, thanks for that point, Justin. I strongly agree with that. So what we're trying to do with this work is introduce analysis and a frame, and also a bunch of tools we do on our capabilities development side that will help people in different contexts with different theories of change to ensure that those strategies are better able to weather, when the SPG collapses, or in a 1.65 degree world, and so on. So that can be whether that's about, I want a situation where the non-violent direct action crowd, the people who are building, local democracy from the ground up as an alternative, and so on, as well as people in the government context, are beginning to think how their strategies can better identify things like derailment risk and how they can be better set up to handle them. I don't want non-violent direct action derailed by even more authoritarian governments that will use climate impacts to justify even more authoritarian responses, which kills off non-violent direct action. I don't want local democracy and citizens' assemblies to be blown out the water by, you know, worsening climate damages and so on. And for me personally, when it comes to my personal contribution, I still am interested in trying to do something in the context of, say, government and politics. I think largely, and this is probably quite cynical and quite pessimistic, because I think that there will still be a political class when these impacts really hit. And if there are some people in it who do things that are marginally less worse than they would do otherwise, then that's a win. In the same way that there were some people who were better able to understand things that might have been needed in the context of COVID. The UK had a particularly, I think, bad response to that, but there were some countries around the world that had a more humane response to how to deal with COVID. And so I think pre-positioning in the context of these large, lumbering, failed institutions is still an important part of what we do to handle the worsening impacts of the storm.
Thank you both. And Janos has posted a question in the chat, which I think follows on from what Justin has just raised, which is, what are desirable social tipping points that we should be aiming for? And I know that Tim Lenton at GSI has tried to develop a body of work around positive social tipping points to go alongside the remainder of GSI's work. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and for those that have not come across that before, I would strongly recommend people having a look at it. You know, if you look at this global tipping points report, there's a whole section on the bad tipping points, the destructive ones that I've talked about. There are then the more productive ones. I think that's a useful lens to apply. I think there can be moments of rapid change, and I think that I'm less going to list off ones that I think are important, and more the fact that we have to use a positive tipping point frame, a productive tipping point frame, as we head further into this storm. Because if we're now in an era of perma-crisis, then there are going to be lots of crises that could be left to go to waste or not be left to go to waste. And those crises could be moments where we could trigger these more positive tipping points. Again, this gets to my point about the derailment risk frame that we're trying to introduce. It's that we shouldn't just be trying to identify positive tipping points that need to be tipped now. There's a lot of focus on technologies that need to be tipped, and you could say we passed the tipping point for some social movements and the awareness around climate change politically and so on. We need to be developing strategies by which we improve the ability to trigger these productive tipping points under duress. So if we can look back to the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008, and the relative failure to have triggered a green recovery then. We could look back at COVID and the mixed picture of whether we built back greener, to use a phrase for some global north governments, and say, well, hang on a minute, what was it about those instances where certain capabilities, whether at a hyper-local level or up to the scale of the big climate policy debate, where is it where we can build the capabilities to ensure that then if/when the next versions, probably climate induced, of those types of crises occur, how can we have the ability to identify, to really push on those positive tipping points?
Thank you. I'm going to try and group some of the questions now. They may not necessarily group particularly elegantly, but even so. So Randy was asking, hopefully, about whether NATO or other military planners are kind of a beacon of good practice, or whether they're, whether you're seeing any real attempts to grapple with these issues. Nicola Kraus has asked about well, I mean, maybe it's about the likelihood of geoengineering solutions, along the lines of Ministry of the Future type scenarios. And then finally, Michael has asked about what are the implications of this for philanthropy, and in particular, philanthropy getting more strategic in response.
So, okay, I'll try and do them in that order. Small questions. Great questions there. So the first one on the defense and security community, things like NATO and so on. My view on this is that, and Randy, I'm interested in yours as well, or anyone else who's got a view on this on the call, but it is inevitable that defense organizations, military organizations are often associated with having a more forward-thinking, longer-term, more realistic assessment of how bad things are going to get, right? And you do see this. For example, when Biden got in, within 1 week of his inauguration, he signed an executive order that mandated the security establishment in the US to undertake a national intelligence estimate, the highest level of national security estimate of a threat, and deal with climate change. And that showed horrendous things were possible. It included things like systemic risk and so on and so forth. It didn't include other things that it should have, I think. But what the defense establishment as an actor, what can it do about that stuff? And this is the concern that I have, is that because of the longer term mandate, it is militaries who have spotted some of these things alongside other people in society, of course, but they are quite constrained in their ability to do something about that in the context of governments. This is not just a defense issue. It's not just something about the need to make sure bases are better adapted and kit can work better under worsening conditions. It's more of that big strategic level. And defense is not the right community within government necessarily to take that argument, partly because of this concern that some people have about securitization, that as things get worse, it will be seen through a defense lens. And I think really we should rebrand that as a fear about militarization, because I think the climate crisis will get securitized in the sense that it will become a national security concern, because the things it will do to us are about national security, like food supply and so on. It will be what the reaction is in those moments that will be really important. And if we're in a situation where it's only been defense ministries who've been telling the high levels of government and the government decision makers that horrendous things could happen, instead of the other risk assessment bits of government that think about health and food and fairness and so on, then they will be the only decision makers that governments look to when these things kick off. They'll ask them to sort it out. And I've spoken to a number of high-ranking people in militaries around the world who are fearful of that moment, because there's only so much equipment that they can use to engage in humanitarian response and then to fight the ridiculous wars that will only further exacerbate the situation. So I think the defense establishment has an important role to play, but it's got to be at the national security level, which I see as slightly distinct at times from defense and things like NATO. For example, in the UK, I'm going to be provocative in saying this, but there's never been a national security risk assessment of climate change. The UK is a rare example of a country that's done lots of climate change risk assessment, but has never done it from a national security perspective. Those risk assessments are largely focused on adaptation, adapting infrastructure and so on. Within the context of government, it's seen in that niche. There's not been at that high strategic level of government that those assessments have been done. And I think that does mean that you don't have a mature discussion about how we're going to respond when suddenly we realize that the curve of climate damages is not linear. It is something probably more like exponential. And I think per the second question, that means that things like geoengineering then become more likely, because there's less of a mature discussion about how you respond to the sudden arrival of globally dangerous climate change. And I think, Michael, to take your question about what philanthropy does in response to this, I think there needs to, for me personally, what we're trying to talk about is to apply this lens where you have a better assessment of the fact that we're now in the storm and not just trying to navigate around it. That is for some people, a big leap. It's a paradigm shift in how they understand the situation we're in. I hope it's not as big a leap after us having gone through COVID, actually experienced global scale systemic threats, to have seen the latest figures on where 1.5 may be, but applying that lens and saying, well, hang on a minute, whatever strategy we have as a funder when it comes to climate action, how is that going to handle these set of plausible events? What does our strategy look like as we head over 1.5? And that's no longer a question of many decades hence. That's now a question more on strategic planning scales, and that a set of requirements for philanthropy then emerges, right, of better foresight, of doing better risk assessment as an institution to better identify those threats to your strategy. And then there's a whole potential area of funding I have a number of ideas about what that is because I have an interest in trying to attract some of that funding. One of them, I think, has to be dealing with this problem around risk assessment in major institutions, if not just because we are flying blind into this storm and we cannot improve our navigational ability unless we have a better situational awareness.
And Laurie, how would you, I mean, just building on Justin's point earlier about not putting too much faith in the institutions that haven't yet shown much capacity to step up to the plate. How would you see this work informing philanthropy's approach to supporting bottom-up movements, such as around local democracy or whatever? Can it, or do you think it's too abstract, too far from where philanthropy normally takes its maybe more often top-down perspective?
I mean, I think that once if you are exposed to the latest work on the kind of things that are now, the kind of scenarios that are now on the table, the kind of things that could happen to the world, the kind of things that happen to certain regions, the stuff that's already happening, but much worse to come, things like triggering of tipping points, when you start to understand how the consequences are not just the immediate impact, but those cascading into systemic risks and so on. Once you do that, I think you have to understand that resilience is a concept that ultimately is rooted locally, and that the point earlier about fairness, that our strategies for sustaining climate action through a less stable future are going to have to be rooted really hyper locally, because only then will only through that can, I think, you make sense of what will end up being globally significant damages, right? If you have certain tipping points being triggered, the abstract idea of what that means is not going to make sense at a hyperlocal level, but the reaction of very local places is going to aggregate up psychologically, politically, and so on to be the thing that matters. So I hope it's a further push for certain organizations to understand that local resilience is a key part of how we deal with being in a storm. So
really, another way of putting your challenge to philanthropy would be to say that it has to try to operate at both a completely global level and a hyperlocal level, and presumably the various fractal levels in between, because otherwise, I mean, unless we have, for example, a declining hard cap on material consumption, along as with fossil fuels just as part of that, alongside hyperlocal security, fairness around food, the whole thing kind of falls apart, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there are different philanthropy, different organizations working at those different levels, right?
Yeah.
And for me, a crucial point still remains, though, that there is no adapting your way out of this. There is no improving local resilience, because at the end of the day, if we do not reduce emissions and stabilize the temperature rise to the level that's needed, we don't know exactly what it is, to stave off, say, an AMOC collapse, then that's ultimately at the global level what matters. We have to, whatever happens, sustain rapid global decarbonisation, even as we handle the worsening impacts of the storm, because we cannot outrun a system destabilisation. And so we have to have both the scales, obviously, but we ultimately have to have that sufficient level of global cooperation or coordination or whatever it ends up being that staves off the very worst tipping points.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to a couple of linked questions from Tamsin and Dorothy. Or maybe the simplest thing is to ask you, Dorothy, to put your question to Laurie. Can you get off mute, or shall I read it out?
Let's get off mute. Thanks, Laura. It's been really interesting listening to you. And for the Red Cross, I represent the FRC, and we have our own climate change center. But it tends to be, and I hate to use this word, but it's true, it tends to be very simplistic. So it tends to do things like tell people, oh, the climate is changing and, it's going to have an effect on communicable diseases. So we have to be more careful about how we deal with water and cholera and stuff like that. No, with the FRC being global and having both a local and a national remit, I'm beginning to wonder, how is it that we can raise the thinking of the Red Cross to become more of an advocate at the government level in each of their countries in issues that you've been talking about? Because we speak to with the ministries on a constant basis. We speak to large donors on a constant basis. We speak community members on a constant basis, but none of this discussion that I have heard here have I ever heard been spoken in the Red Cross. And I think that it's a huge gap, because there's a huge population that's not hearing this, including important people in the government, and I think the Red Cross is well placed to do that. It's a monolith. It's been around forever. It tends to be stuck in its ways, but I think that this is the opportunity for us to somehow try to influence this. And I'm not sure how we raise the thinking of something like our climate change center, which is so simplistic. So it might be an impossible question that I'm asking, and I'm sorry.
Peter, shall I take Dorothy's question?
Go for it.
So I agree with you, and I have been within the context of simplistic or less simplistic analysis of what's going on, I always think the Red Cross has got more sophisticated analysis than many people have, because there is at least some of that on the ground experience of intuitively of how cascading risks play out over time. I think there is this, and I know I've been going back to this a number of times in our conversation. It's not the extent of the work that I do, for example, but there is this opportunity right now to be pushing hard on a growing awareness that the risk assessments that are used by some key institutions are not fit for purpose. So the example that has been pushed on is being pushed on, I think, hardest, which isn't super relevant, maybe in some ways it is relevant to what you're talking about, is with insurers and pension funds and so on. And the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries in the UK, which is the sort of accreditation body for the actuarial sciences in the UK context, has been working with the bit of Exeter University that I work with, and has produced a number of reports that have really shone a light on how pension funds, insurers, and banks are really bad at risk assessment. And that is leading to a response. And there is an awareness that those risk assessments are really poor. And they're poor partly because this thing is so complex, and private companies come and say, hey, we can do your risk assessment for you. And they use very simplistic economic modeling, even more simplistic than what you're probably saying. And I think there is an opportunity, therefore, for certain institutions that have the credibility and can say, well, we see some of these risks play out on the ground, and we can tell you that that simplicity is wrong in these kind of ways, is a really important opening. And I think that opening is going to go beyond just the financial world as well. And I think it can go into things like the national security world and governments. And again, to stress, I don't mean that from a defense perspective. I mean that there's an opening for governments now that they've, particularly global north governments, experienced cascading systemic risk, experienced the gas crisis and energy crisis, experienced a global health pandemic and so on, that there is more of an opening there from institutions like yours that come with that credibility and on the ground experience and so on, to come and say, look, we are also noticing a problem here. We can't solve it just ourselves as one institution, but we've got a lot to bring to the table of how we work out how to make these assessments better.
Okay, thank you.
But happy to talk more about that. And I remember we
Absolutely.
the other day, and you're talking about what you guys are setting up, and I think that's a good start to be able to push that kind of conversation.
Yes, we need that bigger thinking to start happening.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dorothy. Have you come across other institutions, Laurie, in all of your discussions that are really grappling with this in the way that the Red Cross is starting to engage with it, or is it still too early days?
Well, my experience is that when we look at a more accurate analysis of the risks that includes systemic risks and so on, the disaster risk reduction community is for understandable reasons at the forefront of really pushing that discussion. The UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, in its is it every 2 years they do a global assessment report. Those GARs, as they're called, have been really good in recent years of making the point that our discrete risk by discrete risk approach to dealing with the risks that are coming in a world now of multiple crises is insufficient. There's a huge amount of other analysis going on. The Cascades Institute, for example, in Canada, that's run by Thomas Herman Dixon, is a really good example of a place that's starting to connect a lot of these risks together. And I know some of you are aware of them. And there's other examples in many universities around the world where you're getting to the level of systemic risk assessment of like, let's look at how the where the funding for different farms in the Amazon comes from with different banks, and what the climate risks in the context of the Amazon, and maybe even its tipping point, could add up to then impact the systemic integrity of the banking system in the context of South America and so on. When it comes to things like that translating its way through into the actual action of certain institutions, I find it quite hard to see mainstream examples of that. Like the financial institutions that I described, they are still a long way from having risk assessments that include, some of them, sea level rise, let alone cascading socioeconomic risk, let alone tipping points. And there is a desire for that to happen, though, however much we can be cynical about that, probably rightly. The conversation of going in further and completing the feedback loop and talking about derailment risk, of what it's like to be in the storm. I want to have that conversation with people who are not seeing it enough. And if anyone knows institutions that are doing that, then let me know, because we want to talk to them.
To what degree have you looked beyond the global north in your discussions with militaries, institutions, governments? Because it strikes me that if the more that countries historically have, quotes, benefited, maybe or maybe not, but anyway, from kind of world industrial capitalism, the less likely they are to actually really respond to this proportionately. And for example, at the moment, Colombia, coming out of years of deeply right-wing governments electing a former guerrilla as their president, and as a poor fossil fuel producing company saying we are going to stop extracting fossil fuels. It feels as if maybe that's more likely that it comes from global South countries, which maybe have a much more developed feeling of Ubuntu, of being in it together, of actually connecting to nature and the land around them. What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I look at the Bridgetown initiative, out of Mir Motley's office in Barbados as I look at it through the lens of what it's like to be in the storm, that building more solidarity and power outside of a global north context is really important, not just to stop the climate crisis, to avoid it. It's still cast in sometimes in those frames, but because it's what we're going to need to be able to weather that storm. And I think that conversation is more effective, more powerful, and being pushed more by, as you say, by countries in the majority world, partly because they are, it's not one ship, is it, heading into the storm? It's a flotilla, and some are more vulnerable and exposed and further into that storm, and they are developing certain capabilities, certain things that they need and want. So we were talking earlier about fairness. We could think about that in terms of within country, but across country, having that kind of global solidarity that is also inevitably therefore going to have to be honest about the colonial antecedents of the situation we find ourselves in, and on and on and on, is going to be absolutely crucial. So we, by nature of having started what we're doing in the UK, have not had enough of those discussions about how we can develop that kind of global solidarity from the perspective of the power of and solidarity of people in the global majority that's needed to deal with derailment risk. And I really want to have more of those conversations.
This might be very unfair, but I was going to pick on Justin and Eva, who are trying to link bottom-up democracy work in the global north with global south countries. Do either of you want to quickly describe that?
I'll jump in first here. Yeah, is that okay? Thanks. Yeah, so just working particularly in East Africa at the moment with indigenous communities who've suffered the impact of the, colonialism, but they also experience their governments now as colonial. And I find the real problem with thinking about the global south as being represented by the governments that exist in the global south, rather than thinking about the global south as being those who are impoverished by the system that exists there as much as it exists here. So there's a real need to think about the majority world in terms of the people themselves, the communities themselves, rather than thinking of those governments that are mostly kind of appointed by and sustained or removed when they do something that goes against the international order, the international community, so-called, those in power. So we're working with communities there who are very much have experienced the impacts of colonialism and now are experiencing the impacts of climate solutions, which basically means them being expelled from their land so that others can take credit for the fact that there's carbon in their land. So what you were talking about before in terms of the way the indirect impacts of solutions, that the transition, what you call transition, can't remember the word, but the transitional focus, which then makes the situation worse. But the work we're doing with them is basically around supporting them to continue with systems of governance and decision making, which is entirely about people recognizing each other's needs and not about handing power over to anybody, but about having assemblies where you listen deeply to each other and arrive at conclusions. So I've experienced assemblies where you start off with the kind of 50-50 Brexit split that we had, but people very quickly see that the men of my age, bald men my age, arguing on one side and bald men my age arguing on the other side, have both got their own interest to bear, and people deepen to what's the real issue going on here and what the solutions we really need. So there's something about that and the work that Eva and I are doing here with assemblies in the global north, which is about trying to get people to reach down to the deeper needs and have a politics based on that recognition of mutuality, rather than a kind of power over how do we pass power up and make sure that our side wins and their side loses. So what's the value in both positions rather than what's a distraction in both positions. So I guess it's that level of change that we're looking for. Sorry, Eva, I jumped in. Go. Okay.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank
no, I don't know how much I have to say. I mean, I'm just kind of reeling a bit from everything you've said, and how what a, I know what an awful situation we're in, but I try and avoid information on that as much as I can, because it's pretty hard to hear. And yeah, I mean, it does sound like fantastic work that you're doing. And yeah, I mean, for me, I guess I just have completely given up any hope that the governmental structures that we have are able to, willing / able to address the issues in time to stop basically the kind of worst case scenarios raining down on us. So the only hope is in this kind of these hyperlocal responses. And the difficulty there is that we're looking at populations that have, right way across the world for a variety of different reasons, but largely patriarchy and colonialism and capitalism are completely disempowered and don't see the kind of thinking that you're talking about as any of their business. We've been taught to think that thinking at this level and even thinking much about our collective future is really for other people. It's not for us. So I guess I would be really interested in a conversation. I have a friend who extraordinarily is doing her work in her second language. She's Norwegian. She works in English and she translates scientific documents into language that politicians can understand. I think some work translating the kind of things that you're talking about into language that anyone in the community can understand it would be really helpful to people working at our level, really trying to wake people up in place to saying, how are we going to collectively try to navigate this? That's what occurs to me immediately.
Great, thanks, Eva. There's a question about from Barbara. What of China and India? Have you been talking to people in either of those countries?
Yeah, a bit. Would like to have more of those conversations. I think to connect what we were just hearing now, and thanks both for giving us an idea of your guys' work. I'm interested in how those that are building those alternative structures from the ground up can, if this is even possible, it may not even be practicable, develop certain abilities to foresight or whatever, to think about what conditions are going to be like as we head to and over 1.5 degrees, what threats and what opportunities might arise that then could mean that we could have certain social tipping points where these structures become even more successful, right? Because to bring in India and China again, at least from some of the results that I've seen around the potential impacts of an SPG collapse, that is the ground zero for that really is around where it is in the North Atlantic. So it's North America and it's Western Europe as well. So this is a global North shock. It could be a situation in which some countries, including the UK, are very interested in loss and damage because there's been a lot of loss and damage, and it kind of it sort of blows up the current global mainstream climate politics around climate impacts and so on. And in doing so, I would bet that some Western governments will react to that and say, well, hang on a minute, we'll see that through a lens of strategic disadvantage, that we in North America and Western Europe have been hit disproportionately badly. India and China, particularly China, maybe Russia, have not been hit so badly. And they see it through that frame. But in that moment, the dislocation caused by that tipping point being triggered could be something that gives more impetus to bottom-up structures that are saying our governments are running around like headless chickens. They're seeing this through very narrow and very constrained ways of doing things. And so these structures are therefore empowered in that moment of crisis and dislocation, because this is the other side to the derailment story that we haven't emphasized enough. And I've not emphasized enough in this conversation, which is that in moments of crisis and instability, sure, there are threats to more productive change. That's that derailment dynamic. But equally or equivalently, there are huge opportunities for rapid change to occur, because as globally dangerous climate change begins to rain down even more, begins to hit relatively sheltered global north countries and so on and so forth, it has the opportunity to delegitimize existing global power structures within countries, ideas, elites, and so on and so forth. And that could be an immensely destructive, chaotic process. I'm sure it will be, whatever happens. But it also holds chinks of light for then being able to encourage much more positive change. And we've definitely seen that throughout history. Whenever there have been major crises, there are those opportunities for dislocation to lead to more productive and positive change. Improving our ability to help that happen is the sort of grand frame that I'm talking about through the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Laurie. We're getting a bit short on time, but I was wondering, Karine, whether you might have any reflections in terms of humanitarian responses, following on from what Dorothy had to say.
Well, I'm mainly listening because you're speaking very fast and I need
Sorry.
all my concentration to get the point. So thank you very much for the notes and the chat, because it's a very rich and complex discussion. So but it's okay. I think I follow up. Yeah, we are mainly working on the humanitarian responses, but as some of you already know, we also started 2.5 years ago. I work in Fondation de France in a private French foundation to work on disaster preparedness too. And it was a real nightmare to start this program, because then my director was asking me, okay, disaster preparedness, where are you going to work? What are the priorities? And of course, if we want to see the whole picture and the different scenario, not only for climate changes, but also for different conflicts and other natural disaster, it was going everywhere. So we decided to start working on climate change impact, and then COVID came. So it was not really linked. And last year, we get mainly natural disaster with earthquake and wars. So it's very hard to find time to work on prospective issues and to find good organization and concrete discussion about all these issues while running the flow of operational activities every day. But thank you very much, because this is very inspiring. And well, I won't go again on all the discussion, but especially the discussion about the resilience being at local level is very important, because we had, sorry, I think my son wants to come into the house. He's gonna wait. We had a forum on disaster preparedness in Kathmandu 3 months ago, and we were discussing about all these bottom-up issues of how having the community in the territories to participate to the preparedness. And it was a very strong discussion too, with very concrete example about how they do it in Indonesia, how they do it in Nepal, how we are not able to do it in France because we think that the state and the militaries are going to run everything. So yeah, thank you very much anyway, and I hope this can feed a little bit the discussion. It's very interesting.
Thanks, Corinne. I remember an interview with the country lead for Bangladesh on disaster preparedness and response after the floods in Germany, which took a lot of lives. And he was absolutely astonished by how completely unprepared the Germans were. And he pointed out that they had a way, way, way bigger budget than Bangladesh has, and they had achieved literally almost nothing with it. So yeah, another interesting example. Laurie, we've got 2 minutes. Have you got any kind of concluding comments?
Just a massive thanks to having me and for you all listening to me rattle away at such a fast pace, and loved all of the points and questions. The last thing I'd just leave in your minds is, we have to now move beyond binary frames of stories of, we're going to win, we're going to lose, we've got 2 years to save the world, 12 years to save the world, or what the world ends, because that pushes us into continued binary thinking of, well, maybe it will end, maybe catastrophic collapse is going to occur, or maybe tech will just save us and squirrel us at the last minute. We're now into a much harder chapter of the climate ecological crisis. Many people around the world already know that and are living it. That's going to unfortunately get much worse. But again, it doesn't mean that the world ends at a global level. It means that we need to understand that we're now in a different strategic context. And I'm not sure that everyone has necessarily got their head around that. And the frame of the storm hopefully helps with some of that. And I'll put my email in the chat if you want to talk more about the huge level of specificity in projects we are doing to better understand what it is like to be in the storm and what strategies and capabilities might help us navigate out of it. Then please do get in touch. But thanks everyone for listening, and lovely to see you all.
Thank you, Laurie. You've been a complete star. Thank you, Tamsin, for all the organising and for the amazing notes summarising in the chat, which have been really superlative. There's a question from James, I think, saying, how do I save the chat? Tamsin, are you going to save the chat and then send it round with the recording by any chance?
Yes, so we have followed all these sessions with sharing the recording as well as a summary sort of synthesis and then the chat. And Laurie, I will come back to you for some of the reports you reference because we'll put the links to those in for everybody as well. Yeah. I just want to say thank you to both Peter and Laurie. This has been highly anticipated for me and just incredibly insightful, and I'm really delighted to see so many people who've been part of exploring this, so really grateful for the conversation. Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks Tamsin, thanks Laurie, thanks everybody, thanks Peter.
Thank you everybody. Yeah,
cheers.
Thanks everyone.
Amazing. Yeah,
really amazing, just amazing.